what's going on. Book of Joshua, as we pick up, we got mostly through chapter 5, and that wasn't just because we ran out of time. That was because that's where I chose to stop last week. A week before, I guess it is now. It's last time being Mother's Day. But it tells us in chapter 5 that following Israel's crossing the Jordan, and it's kind of a misnomer, isn't it, when you stop and think about it? Normally when you cross a river, you either wade through the water or you find a bridge to take you over the top of the water. Israel did neither of those things. God stopped the water and they went through on dry land. They didn't go through on muddy turf or even wet sand. This was a bona fide supernatural work of God, providing a dry riverbed. And when you stop and think about it, this kind of becomes even a grander scheme. And I don't know whether I mentioned this last time or not. How many of you have seen the Ten Commandments? Charlton Heston, right? Yeah, Ten Commandments, the Moses roll. Okay, yeah, you can't miss that one. Great thing. Now, you remember when he finally got Pharaoh to let him go? And they headed out for the Red Sea, and you have that parting of the Red Sea. You kind of remember the visual impression that was given there by the producer, you know. It was cool. It was cool, and it's still kind of neat. It really is. If you even look at it, 60, 70 years later, the wall of water on both sides, and then you've got a picture of Israel, the nation of Israel, going through on a goat path, right? I mean, you've got one goat cart up here, and then you got a donkey, and then you got 3 people, and behind you got a family, and then you've got everybody's following just like a trail of ants going out there. You realize how long it would take 1 3/4 million people to go through the Red Sea if they did it single file? They'd still be crossing the Red Sea because there'd be so many babies born in the back that they'd grow up and have more babies before, to move that many people across the Red Sea in that short a period of time, you would have had to, God did, roll the water back for a half-mile swath going out through there. They'd have gone through that thing, like I said, probably up, a half a mile wide, okay? In order to get all the people across there in the short period of time that they had. You have the similar type of thing, a lot of similarities, crossing the Jordan, going into the Promised Land under the military and civilian rule, however, the national rule under the Joshua, Moses' replacement. Here you've got the water rolled back. The way it happened, according to Scripture here, was not a swath and like the Red Sea, but it was stopped upstream. Okay, and then the dry riverbed supernaturally was provided, and Israel went across. There's still 1 3/4 million of these people. A whole generation has died in the wilderness. They've been replaced, by, believe it or not, people having babies. In that 40 years, they just didn't all become celibate, okay? There were all kinds of people that were reproduced and have now grown. You stop and think about it. If you were a child just born after the Red Sea parting, okay, you would have been over 40 years old by the time you went into the Promised Land under Joshua. Remember, these people fought battles with skirmishes, but battles with various desert tribes down in, today we would call it the Negev, down in that area. Well, all my map's in there. Okay, next time. Get that. But, within that understanding, you have a huge amount of people that are provided supernatural entrance into the Promised Land. Okay. Significantly, there was a couple of events that occurred. it talks about, and we looked at this last time when you get into chapter 5, is the whole nation needed to be circumcised. All the men needed to be circumcised. Apparently, the token, the covenant reminder, brought about, that's what circumcision was, you remember, instituted under Abraham. Abraham's like 600 years before. And somewhere along the line, in the time maybe they spent in Egypt or whatever, the whole covenantal understanding of Palestine, this land being given to the nation of Israel, had kind of been put on the back burner because after all, they spent 400 some years in bondage back in Egypt. And you kind of speculate that somewhere in there they'd kind of forgotten about God's guarantee of inheriting the promised land. So by the time they get to this point, it is discovered, regardless of the reason, that you had this entire generation of people, okay, that needed to be reminded of God providing the promised land for the nation of Israel. Okay? And the reminder of that promise was circumcision of the male children of Israel. Every time a male child got circumcised, it was a reminder that God's promise was going to come and that the promised land would become that of the Jewish nation. So you had the circumcision scenario, and then you had verse 12, which is kind of interesting, that the manna ceased on the day after they'd eaten up the last of the old provision from their wilderness wanderings. God said, you're in for a whole new ballgame. You're in for a whole new experience at this point. And of course, implied in that is, I'm giving you the promised land, but you're going to have to do your portion of the work. There's going to have to be some effort put into this by the children of Israel. You're going to have to make your own way. I'm just not going to hand it all to you. You know, no more stimulus checks coming in the mail. There's no more direct deposit scenarios for you to look forward to. The manna ceases. The quail all flew off. You know, at however you want to visualize that. These people went in, they crossed the Jordan, they set up on the plain out there, you know, on the west side of the Jordan River, within just almost rock throwing distance of the city of Jericho. Remember, Jericho militarily was a couple of things. Number one, it was considered impregnable. It was a double-walled city of great height, and of course, they didn't have laser-guided smart bombs to go over the walls or anything. The city's defenses were primarily those walls, and Jericho was pretty significantly defended that way. Okay? The other thing that was very significant is Jericho had to be taken. Okay? There's no way militarily that Israel could bypass Jericho with any sense of security in their rear, because you don't leave an enemy of that power and capability breathing into the trunk lid of your car, so to speak, okay? Additionally, militarily, if Israel had just moved on, now you have a significant enemy force that once the waters of the Jordan go down, this significant force could go right across the Jordan River and attack those 2.5 tribes that were left on the other side. Okay? Jericho had to be taken. It was the first major battle, and it becomes a very significant thing, partly because of the whole miracle with the walls collapsing. We'll talk about that in a moment. But to demonstrate that God was giving them the land. It was God who was, in truth, the one who was marshaling the forces of Israel. It wasn't, in other words, going to be strictly a military conquest. God and the spiritual realm was going to be directly involved in providing the promised land for the Jewish nation. Okay? All right, so somebody go ahead, if you would, and pick up with verse 13 of chapter 5 and read the rest of the chapter. There's only 3-4 verses.
Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so.
Okay? This is an appearance, as far as we can conclude, pretty reasonably, of what we would call in the Old Testament the angel of the Lord. Now, the angel of the Lord, many feel, is simply what they call a Christophany, okay? A pre-incarnate vision of Christ, not in the form of Jesus, but in the form of the second person of the Godhead. Okay, not trying to twist your tail theologically, just trying to point out some clarification here. Okay, nobody would have known what Jesus looked like. I mean, come on, this is 1,400 years before the baby's born in Bethlehem. How would anybody recognize that he looked like Jesus? Well, the modern artistic rendering hanging in museums, perhaps, but it's a pretty much of a stretch, and there was no need at this point, because this vision, this appearance of this individual has some significance far beyond just relating him to a baby in a manger or even a savior on the cross. What you have here is, it came to pass when Joshua was out reconnoitering Jericho. Now, I put a word in there, didn't I? Okay. This is Joshua. It doesn't say Joshua and his staff. It doesn't say a group of soldiers. It doesn't say a scouting party. What it boils down to is Joshua is an exemplary military commander. From the time he was 20 as a spy going in at Kadesh Barnea, and he's now, 52? Okay, for the last, well, longer than that, I guess, 57 or 8, because we don't know for sure how old he was when he went into the promised land. He is mid-50s, late 50s. For almost 40 years, he's been militarily involved in the existence of Israel surviving as it's gone through the wilderness, bouncing off of one hostile group of people after another. This guy might not have a lot of War College, Pentagon, 5-star general experience yet, but he has a whole lot of guerrilla small action experience up front and personal. Okay? That is what's involved in Joshua's life. And as a good military man, he doesn't there's no crystal ball. He doesn't, needing to know some things about the enemy, he doesn't bring up Google and ask about Jericho. There are things. He goes out to take a look. Okay? He strolls out of camp, whatever, I have no idea, probably gets up on a little bit of a rise or a high spot, and he's out there. I mean, the camp's right back here, and he's looking at Jericho figuring, now how are we going to do this? It's one thing to do those desert skirmishes with the Ammonites, the Jebusites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and all those other ites. But now he has, for the first time, he has a major problem militarily. He's got a walled city that's standing right there that he has to take down. And he's going, wonder what my options are. I think I'll do just a quick go take a look and get my own eyes kind of geared, get my head around this whole thing. And as he lifted up his eyes looking towards Jericho, There's a guy standing there. And being in the circumstances in enemy territory, as you understand, the man's got a drawn sword. That would make you a little hesitant, right? A little, I mean, if the guy's standing there with a rake and a shovel, it's one thing, right? You know, or maybe waving a branch of cauliflower at you or whatever. But this guy's got a sword and is standing there, and apparently ready to do battle. And Joshua approaches him and says, "Are you on our side or are you on the other side?" I mean, obviously he doesn't recognize him. And he's not, his armor, you know, normally you could tell which side you were on by, I mean, you know, it was simple. Where I was in Vietnam, you know, if they were running through the bushes shooting at you in black pajamas, you shot back. Okay? If they were in a green uniform with a hard hat on, you didn't. That was one of our guys. Simple, right? Not so much. Here's a guy that is in non-description type of armor. His accoutrements don't brand him friend or foe. He could go either way, all right? So this man responds in verse 14, neither. That must have got his attention. He said, now, you're standing there completely armored, complete with sword drawn. Whose side are you on? Neither. Wait a minute. Oh, now what? I mean, you know, that kind of leaves Joshua kind of scratching his head, doesn't it, a little bit? And then he's informed. He says, "I'm here as the captain of the host." He said, and the way it's phrased here in verse 14, "I am here as the captain of the host of the Lord." He just said he was commander-in-chief of the army that Joshua was planning to use to attack Jericho. Okay. Again, you have no specific mention. You don't know how many stars were on his epaulets, you know. You don't know any of the other stuff that, you know, our Hollywood imagination may come up with. But it's Joshua recognized what this was. I mean, where'd this guy come from? You know, we don't have a lot of the individual little detail stuff to support this. Kind of like I mentioned, the graves opened and you had resurrected people wandering around the streets of Jerusalem this morning. What happened to them? You know, where'd they go? Who were they? Yep. Next. We just don't have the information. You know, you can speculate all you want. Okay. Joshua recognizes something distinctive here when this man clearly states, "You are subject to me. I am in charge of this whole operation. I am the captain of the Lord of hosts." Host of the Lord, I guess it is. Okay. Joshua falls on his face and worships. Okay. Worship, the idea of giving reverence, understanding he's in the presence of a supernatural being. Okay. Because Joshua is not going to worship some common soldier from anywhere. You know, he recognizes that. Kathy, sir.
Well, it says, "Behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand, and Joshua went unto him."
Uh-huh.
What does that look like?
But over against him, it means he, appears in something that could be interpreted as a combative environment. When you go against somebody, it implies that there is the possibility of a combative type of scenario. And Joshua approaches him, that's what we're talking about, trying to determine, are you friend or foe? Okay, yeah, that's kind of what the implication there is. But he recognizes. Now, the question usually comes up, well, did this guy, did he wind up, did a halo burst forth? You know, or were there, you know, no, there's no record of anything that would cause Joshua to recognize this guy except the words that he spoke. It doesn't say that the guy started glowing with a heavenly aura. You know, it doesn't say the voice thundered down from the heavens, "This is my beloved son, hear ye him," like it did in the Gospels. There's none of that. But however it was manifested, there is seemingly no hesitation whatsoever. Joshua goes face down because he realizes he's in the face of a supernatural being. He's face to face with a supernatural being. He may not have it down that this is the pre-incarnate vision of Christ himself, the second person of the triune Godhead, blah, blah, yada. We'll let the seminary professors throw bricks at each other, you know, because they don't know any more about it really than you and I do right now. Okay? This is a supernatural appearance of a supernatural being, very probably Christ in his second person of the Godhead situation, and he reveals himself as the commander of the armies, the captain of the host, same difference, the ultimate commander of the armies of the Jewish people. Remember, it's God who said, "I'm going to give this land to you." Joshua is getting a very demonstrable lesson here that you may be the commanding general, but you're not in charge. I am. I'm God. I'm the Lord. I'm in charge. I mean, in effect, that's what he's saying. You need to remember, and Joshua, bless his heart, immediately recognizes and acknowledges his subservient role because God is in charge. Lesson? God should be in charge of every one of our lives as believers. Okay? We are part of the Lord's army. It uses that terminology in the New Testament, in the epistles. Soldiers in the Lord's army. Okay? Who's our commander-in-chief? The pastor? I hope not. Yeah, that you guys are in trouble. No. Because the ultimate commander, there may be in-betweens that, work different areas of responsibility, and God basically is going to tell Joshua, yes, you have the responsibility, humanly speaking, to head up this army for this nation to capture the promised land. Just don't you ever forget that you are serving underneath me. I am in charge. Now, one thing you learn if you're in the military is the guy in charge expects obedience, and he's not going to reward disobedience. Didn't make any difference where everybody else fits in the authority chain, the chain of command. The five-star ruler of the five-star general of the army, that's what I guess they still currently call that. There haven't been that many of them in our modern history. These guys, they call the shots. And everybody else's job is to say, yes, sir, and do what they're told to do. Joshua here says, just as a reminder, he acknowledges, he responds to this supernatural event with an acknowledgement, yeah, that's exactly the case. Jack?
This is not what am I going to say? Too much difference than Moses and the burning bush. Said the same thing. You're standing on holy ground.
A lot of similarities. Yes, there is. That's a good parallel. Okay. Moses, of course, a little difference in situations with Moses going down to do this and Joshua going that way to do that.
They're both getting orders.
But it is definitely who is your commander-in-chief. You might be the guy that runs the human army, but I am the commander-in-chief, and don't you forget it. You're standing on holy ground. Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good observation. Yeah.
Roger?
Yeah.
When Jesus is born, there's the multitude of the heavenly hosts. Do you think whoever this was that Joshua recognized well enough, is he the commander of that host as well? Or is this just the armies of Israel?
No, I would think the captain of the host of the Lord is, I know it's kind of outside of maybe our human grasp, but, he was being omni everything, even as a babe in the manger, and yes, he is, I guess you would say, probably that night, leading the choir, as the heavens broke out in praise and the shepherds responded to it, when they heard, that heavenly music announcing the birth of the Savior. You and I have a hard time envisioning being two places at once, let alone being in the capacity of an entirely different role. One is the second person of the Godhead, and it's now a brand new baby. But you're talking about God here. And with God, nothing is impossible. Okay, this is not hard for God. God can do all kinds of miraculous stuff. He's made kind of a point of it now for thousands of years. The captain of the Lord's host says, as verse 15 wraps up, says to Joshua, "Loose your shoes from off of your feet, for where you are standing is holy ground," and Joshua did so. We have no record of where this supernatural being went, if he stayed there for a longer period of time and gave Joshua explicit details. Now, there is some instruction given, obviously, and we're going to come to that now in chapter 6. So you're going to have kind of an idea of what's going on. Somebody read, the first 5 verses of chapter 6.
Now Jericho was straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. And ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thus shalt thou do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. On the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets. And it shall come to pass that when thou make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people will shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall ascend up, every man straight before him.
Now, if this isn't about the weirdest way to try to attack a fortress, in your way. We don't know exactly how this came about. We don't know when it says that the Lord said to Joshua, "This is your instructions to take Jericho." We don't know, did that come to Joshua in the tent? It may have been included in the instructions at the end of chapter 5, with the captain of the host. But there, you got a hard time pursuing that one in some form or fashion that is not recorded for us to know. God spoke, however, that occurred, whether it was an oral voice or whether it was in some other fashion through Joshua's consciousness or whatever, how the battle was supposed to be won. Okay? Weird, right? I mean, this is not, I don't care how many years you spend in the Pentagon there at the War College, you are not going to get this as a battle plan for taking a defended city. This is not going to work, okay? Human beings don't do it this way, which is exactly the point, isn't it? God said, I'm going to give you this land. That's been a promise now for over 40 years. Your parents' generation messed it up. So now I'm going to take the kids in, so to speak, and you will accomplish what your parents, because of a lack of faith, failed to accomplish. So here's how it's going to work. Jericho was, King James says, straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. Okay? Meaning what?
So, million people out there.
Gates closed, walls manned.
Yes. Yeah, they have shut the gates, barred them from the inside, piled all their loose furniture and rocks against the inside, manned the walls, okay? The reason they did this was because of the children of Israel being on this side of the Jordan. Remember what Rahab told the spies? This city is, the theological term, scared spitless. Okay? Because we have known of all the miracles when God brought Israel out of Egypt, all the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea and the destruction of the firstborn, and we've heard of the manna, we've heard of the quail, we've heard of the water from the rock, we've heard that the clothes did not rot off the bodies of people for 40 years out there. And you've given victory after victory in those desert fights and battles. He said, and the last thing we wanted to see is 1.5 million plus people of the Jewish nation camped right there on the other side of the Jordan River. Okay? Now they're on this side of the Jordan River. And they are busy nailing the doors shut to the city. They're doing everything they can to be straightly shut up. The Lord gives it in verse 2 and following. He says, I have given into your hand Jericho. Now, I'll just tell you ahead, as we go through the conquest over the next 8 or 9 chapters of the book, which is the main conquest record concerning the Promised Land, this is not the normal terminology that's used. God gives Jericho to Israel. He does not continue that pattern for the remaining cities and areas of battle that Jericho has to figure out how to do. Okay? So this one, God says, I got this one. But come Ai, come Carmel, come, the other tribes, come the Philistines, come the other ites out there. That's going to be a little different, but we'll talk about that as we come. Weird battle instructions, okay? He said, in the essence, he said, I don't need your mighty men of valor. I don't need your war plans. I don't need your machine guns. I don't need your F-15s. I don't need armor-piercing rounds. I don't need any of that. In fact, we're going to whip the city simply by walking around it and then blowing the horn and shouting. Wow. Can you imagine being a Jerichoite, dreading to see this? Because what are they expecting? They're expecting a siege. Now here's the problem militarily. Think about it. Israel has no siege engines. They have no towers. They probably don't even have a decent battering ram. They have no experience attacking walled cities. Okay? How are they going to do this? That's all there is to it. They just aren't equipped at this point to do any of these things inside of this type of a military type of event, right? And then the people on the walls of Jericho are anticipating some type of frontal mass attack somehow. And the crack of dawn on the first day, they get out there, and here comes this huge column of Israel troops. And then they turn and march around the city. And then go back to the camp. Now, according to historians, Jericho at that size, if you didn't get, you'd want it to be far enough away that somebody wouldn't use you as a pincushion with a bow, or whatever. But Jericho could have been marched around in 30 to 40 minutes. Okay? It wasn't a huge city by our standards, and you had a whole lot of people that were jammed in there, obviously, because of the threat. But they march around right after dawn. They go around the city, and then you've got this whole serpentine type of column of battle-ready soldiers, and they don't do anything. They just march around the city. Weird. 7 priests bear the ark, 7 trumpets of ram's horns, and you're going to go each day for 6 days. You're going to go around the city once. It goes on and tells us they were dead quiet. Didn't make any noise except for the priests out front doing their own thing at their own time, okay? Except for the 7th day. And the 7th day, once they've completed the whole thing and the whole gang of this, you've got, according to Exodus 14. Anyway, Israel, when it came out of Egypt, had 600,000 fighting men. That was between 20 and 60, battle ready. They had 600,000 men. If they had about the same number at this point, that's a lot of guys surrounding the city. They're making no noise except the shuffle of feet and the clink, clink, clink of various weapons bouncing off of various pieces of armor. That's all they do. And they go around the city once a day for 6 days and then go back and camp. You think, now, put yourself in the Jericho defenders. You go, what in the world? And the 2nd day you go, what in the world? And the 3rd day you go, what in the world? And it goes downhill from there. On the 6th day you go, oh, phooey, look, they're doing it again, Marge. Look, hey, a bunch of nitwits out there. Wonder how long they're going to keep this up. And the 7th day, of course, turns out to be significantly different, doesn't it? God gives them the instruction. When you hear those priests' horns blast, and of course it's significant that the ark is out front leading the nation into battle, then the people shout, and it says that all the walls will fall flat. Now, I'm just doing a jump ahead because we're just going to condense most of the rest of the chapter into about 5 minutes. What you have here is almost outside of God's supernatural intervention, having the walls of a city fall flat, except for Rahab. Remember, she went back and tied that red cord in her window, okay? And there's a double wall scenario on top of it. Everything else falls flat. It has to be supernatural, because earthquakes don't cause anything to fall flat. Anybody ever been through or seen the effect of an earthquake? Yeah, they don't fall flat. You got junk being vibrated and falling in all directions and crashing outward from whatever it's pushing against. That's one of the biggest problems in a post-earthquake scenario, is you have no emergency medical or emergency capabilities whatsoever, because the streets are full of rubble. The buildings have just collapsed. You have no streets. They're completely jam-packed. And now you got fires and water mains and gas mains blowing up, and all kinds of electrical wires, all scattered all over. No electricity, no anything. Well, that's us. Okay. Jericho's walls fell flat. The only way they can fall flat is to fall out. Okay. You got a circular city, basically. It wasn't exactly circular, but you get the idea. And all the walls fell out. That defies human logic. It defies anything except the archaeological proof that goes with it. Now, there are some issues, because Jericho is one of the oldest cities that mankind knows of. It goes back probably thousands of years before the time of Moses. Okay? You're going clear back to the time of Job, if not before. It is an old, old city. According to the archaeologists, they say that the walls of the city have been rebuilt up as many as 30 times. Okay? And when you rebuild walls, the first thing you use is the top layer of the wall that fell down previously. That's your stock building material. So a lot of this stuff gets mixed up, you realize, okay? So that's kind of what you have. And you've got this weird council that goes on. The priests are gonna toot their horns. And when they hear that horn, the people are supposed to shout. I don't know what they shouted. No idea. They shout. And when the walls fall flat, you guys just charge in and kill everybody in the place. Now there's a couple of caveats to the whole thing. Number one, and very important, is Jericho, God said, belongs to me. You get no booty. You don't get to take anything home with you. Okay? You can't pluck the rings off. You can't sack the corpses for the gold coins. You can't steal the flower vases or the coffee table out of a house. You can't do any of that. It all belongs to me. That was the only one that God said that about. And we'll talk about that as we go. Verse 6 says, Joshua, the son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, take all this stuff and this instruction, take the Ark of the Covenant, go around the city, do this circular thing in verse 7, compass the city. Everybody who is armed pass before the Ark of the Lord. In other words, the priest had a particular place, they had to be there, and the armed group passed this, that, and in review. Verse 8 says, it came to pass when Joshua had spoken to the people, they lined up everything. Everything was done just as the way we've outlined it. They blew the trumpets. The Ark of the Covenant led the way with the priesthood. And then here came the army following them. The armed man went before the priest, blew the trumpets. The rear part came afterwards, and on and on. You can worry about all the details and research it on out if you've got a desire to do so. Verse 10 says, Joshua had commanded the people, you will not make any noise with your voice. Okay? You will not shout. You will not have a battle cry. You know what battle cries do? Anybody know what battle cries are in an effective basis? The purpose of battle cries? There's two.
Inspire your own side and strike terror into the enemy.
There you go. Yeah, you're trying to inspire your own troops. Okay? And you're trying to strike fear in the other guy. Who yells the loudest? You ever seen some of these things that, especially in Pacific Islander people, Maoris, very big on it, stand there and beat their chest or put a shield and bang on it, as they scream across the opening. They're trying to intimidate their opponent on the other side of the opening. At the same time, they're trying to work themselves into a battle fever pitch so that they can go across there and basically, it's kind of like Popeye, snorting down, a can of spinach before he goes on to fight the bad guy. They're trying to pump themselves up. Jack?
It's kind of like transferring your fear to the enemy.
If at all possible, yeah. Yeah, David.
There's one place in the sporting world where they do that. The New Zealand rugby team does that. They have a certain chant that they do.
Okay, to work themselves up so that they can just get out there and just strike terror into the hearts of their opponents. Okay, yeah. So you see that some of this, it's exactly what happens. Okay, this is different. God's instructions are no battle cry, no chants. Not even told, you can't even do up, 1, 2, 1, left, right. Said, no, shut up. Just go out there and kind of follow whoever's in front of you and wind your way around the city and then come back and wait for lunch. Because it's only, it's not going to take them that long every day. Okay? But, he said, when the priests tell you to shout, on the day that you're supposed to, then you shout. So give it all 7 days worth of shout. Okay? Probably a battle cry, the way we would do it, because they knew at that point that they were going into the city. The ark, verse 11, compassed the city. Going about it once, they came back to camp, lodged in the camp, put their feet up, flipped on CNN, and talked about all the stuff that, they know was perfectly valid, because if after all, if it's on the boob tube, it's right. Yeah, that's what Abraham Lincoln said. If it's on the internet, it's true. So, so we won't even talk about Facebook. So, Joshua rose early in the morning. The priests took up the ark, 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets made from ram's horn. And again, you've got a lot of 7s here. I've forgotten how many, a couple of dozen mentions of 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. Without getting too much into wacko, how do you put it, Don? The weeds. 7 is normally associated with a completed action of God, a fulfilled parameter. And sometimes we call it perfection. Sometimes it goes that far, perhaps, but sometimes, no. It just means it is a finished plan. Okay? God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. Not because he was tired, but because it was a finished work. And it was perfect, it was just exactly right. You get the idea. So there's 7s in there. Don't be a little careful if you get into biblical numerology, because you can read into the text a lot of stuff that simply is not there. And pretty soon you are the cult leader of the toenail fungus movement. Okay, so be a little careful on this stuff. Okay, so you see what's going on. Verse 14, the 2nd day they did it again, and they did this for 6 days. Verse 15, we're now getting to showtime. All right, came to pass on the 7th day they rose early, about dawn, compassed the city the same manner. Only this time they compassed it, you ready for it? 7 times. Okay? On the 7th day, 7 times, 7 of this, 7 of that. You see, God is putting together a package deal of completeness, totality, a finished work. That's what he's presenting with this whole thing that's going on here. Now, what are they doing on the walls of the city? Somebody, the word probably got around. They're going around again. They're going around a 3rd time. They haven't done this before. This is something different. For 6 days, they've gone around once and gone back and put on beans and franks, with cornbread. Now, all of a sudden, they go around the 2nd time, the 3rd time, the 4th time, and the people are going, something's going down. Yeah, there's something else is going on. You can almost imagine that the walls were full of onlookers, okay? Probably a large percentage were probably the military defense people for the city, anticipating that there's something different now going on. Again, speculating a little bit, I understand that, but knowing a little bit about some of this stuff and human nature, you can see that, okay? Now, verse 16, it came to pass at the 7th time, that when the priests blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, shout, for, ready for it? The Lord has given you the city. You don't have to break down the walls or the gates with siege engines, battering rams, or fire towers, or catapults with throwing pitch globs or anything else. I'm going to take away all of the major defense of the entire city. And I would suggest to you, with much of the military force manning the ramparts on top of the walls, when the walls came down, it probably diminished the military capability of Jericho to do any type even of person-to-person battle. I mean, just the mass confusion, dust clouds, that's one of the things that sometimes you forget. It is how much noise and confusion. Yeah, how many of you have ever studied the Civil War at any great length? With some of the battles, I know Ben has. Some of the rest of you maybe a little bit. Between the black powder smoke from not only the personal firearms but the cannon fire, it got so congested, and then like on Gettysburg with the morning fog rolling in and stuff, you couldn't see 20 feet in any direction. And you're breathing gunpowder smoke. And it is what, the 28th of June?
3rd of July. 3rd of July.
3rd of July, thank you, is right, okay? It, cause it's a multi-day battle, and these guys are still, most of them wearing their winter uniforms, wool uniforms, okay? It's 93 degrees with 2,000% humidity, and there is just a wall of smoke and gunpowder, you know, and fog and everything. You can't see anywhere. You don't know what's going on. And you've got masses of animals, horses, and men running back and forth. The dust is boiling. The guns, you know, this thing is mass confusion. Now, you can't hear anything. Okay? You simply cannot hear anything. Okay? For those of you that don't have a comprehension of this, you know, inside of a battle of any kind, including just swords and spears, with men, thousands of them, screaming at the top of their lungs, and the rubble flying and the dust billowing up, you can't see, you can't hear, nothing goes on that really makes any sense except mass confusion. You'd better have a well-trained military outfit that knows what it's doing. Otherwise, you're going to wind up getting turned around, going the wrong direction, and getting into a big fight with your own guys if you can't recognize them. Okay? Now, in modern day, of course, you have all kinds of noises. You've got high explosives going off. You've got machine gun fire. You've got warthogs, you know, blowing stuff up, tanks firing, mortar rounds going off. You've got all kinds of stuff that creates noise. Okay? 600,000 men screaming at the top of their lungs, going upslope to storm the rubble that's left. There's so much noise you can't hear yourself think. Yeah, I'm just trying to paint a picture for you to see what God has provided when He delivered Jericho here. Because normally, if you have to take a walled city the normal way, it's got some issues. That's why when you get to AI, you find if they're luring people out, and it's kind of neat stuff from a tactical point of view. In any case, it says, verse 17, here, remember I mentioned that God threw in a couple of particular little things? The city will be accursed, everyone in it. He uses the term accursed, probably not the best translation. Somebody got something else? Verse 17, the city shall be
Devoted.
Hmm?
It says devoted.
Devoted, yeah. It's a better term for, as we understand the language, okay? In other words, God is saying the city belongs to me, okay? You, the army of Israel, may think that they are taking the city. You need to remind them they are not. I'm giving them the city. Therefore, since the battle is mine, the victory is mine, all the loot is mine too. Okay? Doesn't belong to you. Okay? Only Rahab, the harlot, will live. Okay? Kill them all. Not particularly politically correct. Okay?
It's kind of hard for her to get past her title, wasn't it? Rehab the heart.
Yeah, it seems like that's the way.
Everybody
You know,
remembered her that
Yeah,
way.
I imagine that yeah, it's definitely a social stigmatism, you know, on a moral basis and a cultural basis. But we find it, I think, recorded over and over to remind us that the people God uses don't have to be perfect. They don't have to come from a select elitist group. They don't even have to humanly be moral, you know, in many cases. God can use all kinds of broken vessels for His purposes. You know.
Also, anyone could be saved.
Yeah, exactly. Same concept, you're right. Okay. Okay, so it tells us then, now remember the deal with Rahab, the agreement. You gotta be in the house. The house, and boy, it didn't take Rahab any time to put the red rope outside, you know, but your relatives have to be in the house. If they're outside the house, they either died when the walls fell or Israel killed them all. One or the other. Okay. Okay. And the instruction to the army, verse 18, if you in any wise keep from yourselves from the accursed thing, as King James puts it, he says, you will make yourselves accursed when you take of the accursed thing. You see, there's a curse placed upon this. That's why the King James uses that term. And some translations use the term devoted. But it is, in a very real sense, accursed. If you go against God's commands, then when you break his command, you wind up being cursed. Okay? Simple enough, right? Kind of get the idea. He says, verse 19, all the silver, gold, vessels of brass, iron are consecrated to the Lord. They'll come into the treasury of the Lord. Some of these were used in, as God puts it, a fairly short period of time, for not only buying supplies as they traveled through the land, but for eventually some of it was melted down and even used, in the construction of the first temple. And everything that goes with it, but I won't bore you with all the history. Verse 20 says, the people shouted. Came to pass when the trumpet came off, the people shouted. With a great shout, the wall fell down flat. There's that term again, very specifically, flat. So that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him they took the city. They had it all around. What's implied here is when the walls fell out, the men went straight in. Now, obviously, they'd have had to go up over some rubble, but there was no climbing over all of the hodgepodge of something that would result, for instance, from an earthquake at all. They all went woof, straight in. Very effective technique. They utterly destroyed everything in the city, men, women, old, young, ox, sheep, donkeys, you name it, killed them all. Joshua had said to the two men that had spied out the country, you have a special responsibility. You need to get to Rahab's house, okay? You need to pick out where that red cord is. You need to be right in front of that red cord when the walls go down, and you need to get yourselves there. Okay, as fast as you possibly can, go there and retrieve the woman and everybody else that believed the promise of God enough to get inside of that house. See, in a way, that's the ark, isn't it? Yeah. It says, if you believe, you'll get inside because I'm going to destroy everything else. Again, similar, a parallel type of thing. All right. So that's what you have. The young men went, brought out Rahab. Her father, gives you a list here if you're interested. Father, mother, her brethren, brothers and sisters, and all that she had. Now, they lugged home her coffee table, the fridge, the toaster, the mixer, the washing machine, whatever was inside that house that had any value, they just hauled it all off along with the people and took it. Well, the woman needed something. What are you going to do? Haul her back to the Israelite camp? I mean, she's a square peg in a round hole anyway, isn't she? I mean, not only being a harlot, as has already been pointed out, but now she's the only surviving member of the entire city of Jericho, which are directly adversarial culturally to the nation of Israel. She's the only survivor. Now, wow, you talk about somebody that's a green monkey, somebody who just is going to be a marked individual. Yeah, she's definitely in that category at this point. And so God is providing for her a specific instruction. She's going to need her household goods. She's going to need, that bag full of silver coins sitting on the counter. So move it with her. Her rugs. Her beds, everything, okay, her Monopoly set, I don't know. She's got this stuff, bring her along with it, and they brought it all out and brought it to the camp of Israel. Verse 24 says, they burnt the city with fire, everything in it. He said, only the silver, the gold, and the vessels of brass and iron, and they were put in the treasury house that belonged to the Lord. Joshua saved Rahab the harlot alive, her father's household, and all that she had, And at the time that the book of Joshua was written, said Rahab is still alive and living inside the nation of Israel under the protection, you would assume, of the nation of Israel as well. Why? Because she hid the messengers which Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. You know, Hebrews 11 says, by faith, Rahab hid the spies. And we've looked at that before when we looked at chapter 2. By faith. Okay? That's the operative principle when it comes to human beings responding to God's declarations. Okay? By faith. God said it. I believe it. That settles it. End of story. No debate. Joshua, verse 26, adjured. I love that word. You have something different, I'm sure. At that time, saying, cursed is the man before the Lord that rise up and builds the city of Jericho. He's now laying a curse on rebuilding the city. I mean, the thing has been leveled, everybody's been killed, everything in it has been burnt by fire, and now it's got the direct curse of God given through Joshua, on anybody rebuilding the city. Jericho was not rebuilt in any way for 500 years following this. Okay, the word got around. Don't mess with the God of Israel, because this was one of the strongest cities in ancient times as far as its military defenses that ever existed. And God used trumpets and a shout. Don't mess with the God of Israel. Okay? And for 500 years, it was pretty effective in keeping Jericho from ever, in any fashion, ever being rebuilt. Okay? So it says, the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout all the country. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, well, you heard of that 10 plagues in Egypt? Yeah. You heard of the Red Sea parting? You heard of all the battles in the desert? You heard of the manna and the quail and the water from the rock? You heard about the victories in the Sif Jordan? You heard about the river drying up miraculously and Israel coming in? You heard about God causing the manna to cease, and now the land was before them, and now to add on to all rather miraculous stuff that the God of Israel has done, now guess what? Yeah, Jericho has been flattened, totally demolished, and everybody in it except for a prostitute has been killed, and the whole city has been burnt. God has put a curse on that city. I think I'll go somewhere else and invest in property. If I'm looking for a little vacation condo or a little retirement home, Jericho is simply not on my top 10 list. Not after the reputation of all of that. And guess who humanly is the commander of all this? Joshua. Okay. So he is associated with everything that God has done. Remember what God told Joshua when he took Moses' place? Okay? Be strong and of good courage. And 3 times as he called him to replace Moses as his servant, you just be strong and courageous. I'll take care of the battles. Kathy?
How old was Joshua at this time, do you think?
At this point, about 60, 58, 60. Maybe not 55. I'm getting kind of fuzzy in my old age as far as the dating. We would assume that he went into the promised land 2021, probably one of the youngest guys going in. We say this because he backdated. He was 110 when he died. And we know the conquest of the land was this long, and then the extended conquest of the peripheral land was this long, because it's all laid out in Joshua, and he had to be at least 20, so we backdate the 38 and a half years in the wilderness with the overlap, and you pretty much come out to You know, if you add 38 to 20, he had to have been at least 58 going in to the promised land. Okay. He had intense battles for 8 years and then continued to fight virtually for the rest of his life until he got right up to almost to the time of his death. Okay. So he spent 20 years growing up, and he spent 40 years wandering around watching everybody die, and then he spent the next 55 years doing God's battle on a human basis. Wow, pretty neat stuff. Yes, Sue.
Years ago, I took a class in history of the ancient Near East.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very interesting class. But he told us, the professor did, and you can tell me if he's right or not, but that archaeologists dug down through the Jericho
The
debris
layers of rubble.
until they came to a place where the walls were just out,
Mm-hmm.
flat.
Yeah.
So you could actually see that had happened.
That type of event had occurred at some
Yeah.
time, yeah.
Except for 50 feet of the wall in the lower section.
Yeah,
You can actually look it up online. and
go
see
look it up
Yep.
online. Yeah, some of this stuff archaeologically is fantastic, it really is. Mike?
Well, when Jericho was rebuilt 500 years later, did the person that instigated that rebuilding lose his firstborn son?
Yeah, he did.
It's in scripture.
Yeah.
Where is that at?
Yeah, the curse was still in effect, and he thought that the curse had probably died out. Didn't work out well for him. He should have paid attention to the curse. Yeah. Okay. Kev?
You know, I wonder, Jericho and presumably most of the land knew the Israelites by reputation and presumably Moses.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if they were a little more relaxed when they found out Israel's head and military genius had died on the other side of the Jordan.
Possibility?
And now we hear here that Joshua's reputation is established in a big way.
Mm-hmm.
People were probably no longer relaxed. They figured, well, I guess that isn't gonna help us now.
Yeah, very likely, very likely. Yeah. Okay. Well, did you shut that thing off yet? Do so.